Welcome to the Personal Development Mastery Podcast. I'm 𝗁𝗁𝗄𝗯𝗃 and my mission is to inspire you to rise up, grow, stand out, and take action towards the next level of your life. I interview leaders, influencers, entrepreneurs, authors, exceptional people who can and will inspire you to improve your life. Tune in for 2 episodes each week and make sure you subscribe to the podcast to get the episodes as soon as they are released. This is the second half of the utterly fascinating and mind-blowing conversation with Mark Gober. If you missed the first part, please go back to the previous episode 132 and the conversation will make so much more sense if you start at the beginning of it. This is great, and I wanted to ask you, going back to what you were saying, that what if the brain does not produce consciousness, but instead it receives it like an antenna. This obviously has tremendous implications in the way that people live their life, because most people, arguably, I think it's most people, that don't have that idea at all, even in a spiritual sense. They are very, very absorbed, if I can use that word, with that consciousness, their life experience, their awareness is all in here. And there are so many phrases in the language that kind of describe that as well. So my question really is there something that one could do to have a different understanding, or maybe accept that a little bit more in order to be able to research it?
Well, as you were asking that question, I think there are two significant implications, or more than that, but two that I like to focus on, of the whirlpool and the stream analogy, because I think this is a starting point for how someone could look at this from a different way. Mm-hmm. If you imagine that you're a whirlpool within a stream of water, if some of the water from my whirlpool gets into your whirlpool, which could happen in an interconnected stream, that would be analogously like some of my consciousness getting into your consciousness. That would be like a telepathic or a psychic effect. Mm-hmm. So one of the predictions of this model of consciousness is that psychic phenomena would be real. They wouldn't be weird anomalies. They wouldn't be paranormal. They would be normal if we just change what we agree to be normal, if it's all one consciousness or something like that. That's number one. Number two is, if you imagine a whirlpool that delocalizes, it stops being a whirlpool. The water just flows back into the stream. That would be analogously like someone who's in a body where their physical body dies, their consciousness actually doesn't die, it transitions into a new state, it flows back into the broader stream. So these are the two big implications for me as I've studied this, that psychic phenomena would be real, and also there would be something known as the survival of consciousness after bodily death, meaning you don't die, which is a very radical thing to say, but now for me, I'm almost desensitized to it because there's so much evidence. And the way I've approached this, from a rational academic perspective, as someone who's in business, saying, if I'm going to write a book about this and do podcasts, I have to have a rational way of looking at this. If there's any evidence for psychic abilities and any evidence for survival of consciousness after bodily death, even one piece of evidence, then the model that the brain creates consciousness cannot explain it, or would have an extremely difficult time explaining it, because those things should not happen. If consciousness comes from the brain, that would mean your consciousness is just almost like an illusory construction that emerges and pops out of your skull, and it's stuck there. There can't be anything that goes outside of it, because it's not connected to anything. Yes. And there could certainly be no consciousness after death, because the mechanism for consciousness is your body and your brain, and when that turns off, it's like a computer shuts off, so there can't be any consciousness anymore. But if we're connected as one stream, what 𝗁𝗁𝗄𝘆𝗀𝗃, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, said, he said, in truth, there's only one mind. So the quantum physicists understood this. If we're part of one mind, and we are, like, as Kastrup says, it's like one mind has dissociative identity disorder. We're dissociated into these alter egos, whirlpools, and we can explain this stuff very easily, of psychic phenomena and survival of bodily death. Mm-hmm. And that's my first book, actually. It's structured that way. In the podcast, to an extent, is structured that way. I have chapters on these things. So in the book, there's a chapter on telepathy, mind-to-mind communication. There's a chapter on the evidence for remote viewing, which is seeing something that's far away with your mind, both in space and time. There's evidence for precognition, which is knowing or sensing the future before it happens, which is this idea that consciousness is not only fundamental, but it's also beyond space and time. So it can reach forward, it can reach backward, because time doesn't even exist at this level, at this high level. I also look at psychokinesis, which is the mind impacting matter. Just sort of like if you change the waves in the pool, in the stream, then the physical manifestations of reality would change in a corresponding way. So the mind is actually impacting reality. So that's the psychic abilities. And I also looked at the evidence for all this stuff with animals, because they're scientists that looked at this. And then I looked at near-death experiences, which are people that have no brain functioning at all, or little brain functioning, like they have cardiac arrest or some kind of major physiological trauma, or they're under general anesthesia, and yet they have lucid experiences, which we could talk about a bit more, because there's evidence that that's not a hallucination. Looked at communications with the deceased. So these are people that claim that they can get information from dead people and then communicate it. Mediums, there's actually scientific evidence for that. And then finally, I have a chapter on children who have memories of a previous life. And I'm referring to research done at the University of Virginia, over 2,500 cases for decades. And sometimes the children have memories that can be validated by the researchers looking at historical records. And sometimes the children have birthmarks or physical defects that match with medical records of a person that did die in the manner that the child describes. Crazy stuff. So my overarching point here, Aki, is, wait a second, if any one of those things I said is real, we haven't even talked about all the evidence. If there's any evidence for one thing, that's what I want to harp on. One thing. Brain equals consciousness can't explain that very well. It's much easier to explain if I want to be rational, to say, okay, we got to just shift the model of consciousness and we can accommodate for all this stuff. And that's my starting point for anyone who wants to look at this from an intellectual perspective, is to say, okay, can I deny all the science? And if I can't deny it, then wait, maybe I have to rethink my view of reality.
Thank you for this answer, Mark. And you know what came to mind while you were saying that was that science really is finally catching up with some elements that a while back they would consider completely the elements of religion. Because what you were saying about consciousness not disappearing once we die, but going back or dissolving, or in other words, that it doesn't die. It is something that religions, no matter how much the message has been distorted through the ages, but they have been saying that we are immortal, shall we say, or we're made in the image of Creator and so on. So for me it is amazing, because I have both scientific background and spiritual, or if you wish, curious background, which leads to the other one. So it's great to see that they are finally that chasm, that gap that is starting to be bridged and finally have proof. I think it is only inevitable. It's only a matter of time before the proof will be so solid that no one would be able to ignore that. It would be like as obvious as gravity or something.
Well, I agree with you. And one of the things that shocked me most when I first started on all of this is I couldn't believe how much research there was on all of this. I mean, peer-reviewed scientific papers. The US government has declassified CIA documents talking about the reality of remote viewing, psychic spying, using people's minds to find things that are far away in these documents. And on my podcast, I interviewed Russell Targ, who was one of the leaders of the program in the 1970s and 80s, which went into the 90s, and he was there for part of that time, but actually training people to do this. So there's so much evidence for it, and yet how could it be that the mainstream scientific community doesn't talk about this? And in fact, there's an aversion to it, because now I've gotten to know many of these scientists who study these anomalous topics, the paranormal. I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which was founded in 1973 by an Apollo 14 astronaut who had a mystical experience coming back from the moon that he speaks of. He's passed away, but he spoke of frequently and said, well, we need to be studying this stuff scientifically in an independent institution, because at most places, if you're a scientist who says, hey, I want to study precognition, which is how you could know something before it happens, they're going to say, okay, good luck getting tenure. It's not going to be an easy path for you.
Yes.
So I've had to think really hard, okay, what's going on here? Because we are at the infancy of learning about these things. I will acknowledge that. Like we might know that there's an effect, but we don't really understand it. However, there's strong evidence for the fact that there is an effect happening. And it's been going on for a while that we've known about this. And I thought I had a good education and I knew nothing about this. And if I talked to my colleagues about it, they would tell me I'm crazy. And they have said, okay, that's crazy stuff, doesn't exist. So what's going on here is part of it, I think, is there's a paradigm shift happening. And with paradigm shifts, people have a difficult time changing their thinking, especially if you're a PhD. Imagine you're a well-known professor with tenure and someone comes along and says, look, you know this theory you've been talking about your whole life? You missed the biggest thing ever, which is that actually consciousness is fundamental and you have to rethink everything you've done. Even though what many scientists have done, there's reality to it. I would just argue it needs to be recontextualized in the context of a consciousness. So I think there is a resistance naturally to this stuff that in some ways I'm discouraged about because in the last few years, maybe there's been a bit more receptivity to this, but in a lot of ways, there's still closed-mindedness, even though the evidence seems to accumulate and it gets more and more airtime. I'll tell a personal story that really helped me understand this resistance. So when my first book came out, Into Upside Down Thinking, I hired publicists to help me with it and to help me get the word out. And I was so excited to get this message out to people because I said, look, I put all the evidence in one place. And I this is life-changing. It changed my whole life and it could help people so much and science could change. So let's get it out there. And I really wanted to get this to the mainstream scientists, even though I knew that there's been resistance. And I wrote about some of the scientists who will say, look, I won't even look at the evidence no matter what happens. Some of them will say they'll say that there might be evidence, but I don't want to see it.
Imagine that.
Imagine that.
How unscientific is that?
It's so unscientific, but that's the irony of it. Science has become a religion in that sense. It's dogmatic. But we reached out to, among other places, a mainstream scientific journal to say, look, there's this book and many scientists have endorsed this book. Would you like to feature it in your scientific journal or at least talk about it? This was a big time editor at a big time scientific journal that everyone knows of. He just said, no, I'm not going to look at it. And I told my publicist, I said, we got to show him some evidence. Let's send him the CIA documents and let's send him a paper that came out in 2018. It was published in American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. It doesn't get any more mainstream. Yes. And it compiled all of the statistical evidence for things like telepathy and remote viewing and precognition, psychokinesis, those things I mentioned of psychic phenomena. He compiled, it's called a meta-analysis of taking all this analysis that's been done, putting it together in all these areas and saying, look, there's a strong statistical effect where in other areas of science, we accept these things to be real if we get this level of significance. And it doesn't mean that it's a big effect. It's just statistically significant. And I'll give an example to give your audience a sense of how this works. In the study of telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, the classic study, it's known as the Ganzfeld experiment. You have one person in a room, we'll call that person Bob, and you have another person, we'll call her Jane. These are not people that claim to have psychic abilities. They're just normal people. Sometimes they're college sophomores doing studies just because the scientists need them to be done.
Yes. And
Bob's sitting in a room. He's put into a relaxed meditative state because the scientists know that when you're in a more meditative state, you might be more receptive psychically. But he's just put in a more relaxed state. And Jane is shown an image, and she's asked to try to mentally send the image to Bob from far away. So she doesn't know what's going on. She's trying to mentally send this image to Bob, excuse me, and Bob doesn't know what she's looking at. So after a while, Bob is shown 4 pictures. He comes out of his relaxed state, and the experimenters say, Bob, which of the 4 was Jane sending to you mentally? Bob will say, well, I don't know. Pick this one. You would expect that Bob would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times if there were no effect. It should be 25%. 1 out of 4. Over time, over many, many trials, it should approach 25% because how could Bob get any information from Jane and they're not psychic and psychic's not real? So what the studies show is that it's closer to 32% of the time that Bob guesses correctly or the person in Bob's room. 32% versus 25%, that's nothing, you might say. That's 7% differential. But statistically speaking, it's massive effect. And it's in a category known as 6 sigma. There are other studies that meet this too in psychokinesis and other areas. 6 sigma means that the odds this is happening due to chance alone, this deviation due to chance alone, is more than 1 billion to 1 against chance. More than 1 billion to 1. So this is what's known as small but statistically significant. And what Dr. 𝗍𝗶𝗄 in this very well-respected journal, what he put together is the statistical evidence for all this stuff. So back to my story. We sent him, the editor of this paper, we sent him the CIA documents which say, I'll give a direct quote, remote viewing, which is the ability to see something far away with your mind, remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary, and they show the scientific panel that evaluated these studies, including someone from Caltech, in the declassified document that's now open to the public. So we sent him these 2 documents. And I said, okay, surely this will be enough to get him to engage. And his response was, the CIA is not a scientific body. And he said something to the effect of, the American psychologist paper is laughable, something like that, just didn't take it seriously. And that was the end of the engagement. He didn't want to engage beyond that and didn't want anything to do with it.
I suppose, like anything, that not everyone is ready to receive a knowledge at any given time. Everyone, when the time is right, they do receive it. And I remember that quote that I like very much as well, that truth goes through these 3 stages always. First it is ridiculed, isn't it? Then violently opposed, and third it's accepted as self-evident. So,
yeah.
And the more I see these things appearing, or new knowledge, or even with what's going on with COVID, knowledge does go through these stages, and it's very easy to ridicule something that only time will tell whether it was to be ridiculed or whether it became the truth. As with everything really in history, we can't see the future.
Right. Well, this is how science progresses, through paradigm shifts and learning the old way of thinking needs to be revised. Excuse me. In my professional career, I worked a lot with intellectual property, especially when I moved to Silicon Valley. So things like patents. A patent is something that is both novel and non-obvious relative to everything that's been done in the past. So thinking about this idea of paradigm shift, I saw this all the time. If there were a new patented technology that would come out, there would be resistance in the industry to it. By definition, because it's something novel and non-obvious. And the scientists, the mainstream scientists, are the ones that preceded this invention would say, no, this is not how it's done. We do it this way. So there's always this tension in science, and there's a human desire for their own belief systems to remain intact. There's an egoistic aspect to it if one especially has promoted an idea to be resistant to something that would challenge it. And then it also takes a lot of mental energy to chips one's way of thinking. I mean, for me, it took so much energy, and it's so disorienting and disturbing to think that I was so wrong. I mean, I don't know exactly what's right now still, but I know that whatever I thought before was completely wrong. And I think there's even another level to this that's probably harder to put our finger on, but what we're talking about here is an incredibly empowering idea. It empowers the individual, that we are part of this universal consciousness. That means every single person is significant in some way, and every person's mind has power and influence in the world, no matter who you are, no matter what your socioeconomic class is. So one could imagine that those in positions of power or who have this kind of knowledge would not want everyone to understand how this works. So it's hard to understand if there are social engineering forces as well, in addition to our own resistance to new ideas, that there could be reasons for this information to be suppressed. And I'm receptive to that because there just seems to be so much evidence and such resistance and even within the media to ridicule this kind of thing. I'm thinking to Dr. 𝗍𝗶𝗄, who is a former Cambridge biochemist who studied a lot of these psychic abilities. His Wikipedia page says that he's a pseudoscientist. So he uses something like that in the first sentence. So if you are an everyday person who doesn't have much time to research, and you say, look, let me look at the psychic thing, I'm just going to look at Wikipedia. He's a pseudoscientist. You're probably not going to continue. And that sort of thing, I think, keeps the science down.
Yes, and I won't even go into Wikipedia or Facebook or all the other media outlets which control eventually what information will be received by the general public, because one who really wants to go deeper probably will go past Wikipedia, but for most people that would be enough to stigmatize a person and for people to say, no, this is not credible, he's a quack, or because Wikipedia said so. Whoever writes that, that's a different story. Yeah. Mark, can I ask you, looking forward, as more and more of this knowledge and scientific evidence comes around and people realize it and more people accept it and there is less and less resistance. So looking ahead in the future, how do you see humanity changed by this realization?
I'm thinking of Rupert Spira, who is a philosopher in this area. He talks about how we look at the world's problems. We could name them very easily. There's so many problems that we could all point to in the world. He says they're all symptoms. Mm-hmm. They're not the disease. The disease is the misunderstanding of reality and the misunderstanding of our identity. That our identity is consciousness beyond the body as an interconnected thing. Our identity is not our body. So that's the biggest thing of all. If we could understand that, if everyone really understood that and lived it, and this is more my second book, and End Upside Down Living, how do we embody that? Mm-hmm. That's huge, but it's hard. I mean, because there's so much conditioning. We have to overcome our old way of thinking, and we're in a body that makes us believe the world as we see it is what it is. So there's a lot of hurdles to overcome in this process, but I think that's the ultimate thing that we can really, if we can get to, and then there's a dedication component to this, that it takes so much mental energy and time and commitment to really want to go down this path, to fully embody it. Mm-hmm. And some call it the path to enlightenment. There are lots of different names for it. And I can say this from my own experience because I've prioritized this, left my career, that there are challenges to it. But I think if more people committed to these things like personal development and spiritual development, it could improve the world in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Is there a line, do you think, where that trying to transcend that idea that the consciousness is inside our head, is there a line where this goes beyond just intellectually understanding it and having to use some kind of, deeper understanding, spiritual if you want, or something more than the mind itself? And
yeah,
now I pointed here, which after our conversation, it's a mistake, but it is, at least I realized when I did it.
Well, I want to comment on that because our sensory organs are located up by our head. Yes. So we hear, we see, we taste. So it feels like our consciousness is up there. And some people have offered a thought experiment. What if our eyes were at our feet and our ears were down there? Where would we experience consciousness? Uh-huh. But you're getting to a very important point, which is the embodiment and the experiential aspect of all this. I like the way the yogic tradition breaks this down. They talk about 4 pathways, mm-hmm. which I think can be incorporated into any tradition that you could think of. The first is the pathway of wisdom. It's known as jnana yoga. And in theory, all of these lead us to an embodiment and an understanding of all the things we've talked about. So there's the wisdom path, there's the karma yoga path, which is selfless service. There's the bhakti yoga path, which is devotion. This could be rituals, chanting, prayer, an attitude of being gracious in the world. And 4th is generally energy, which could be anything from yoga to meditation to breathing exercises to nutrition, anything to focus on the energetic aspects. Mm-hmm. So wisdom, selfless service, devotion, and energy. They're like different pathways up a mountain that gets you to the same point of that many enlightened sages have spoken of. They speak of very similar things, of a oneness, an unconditional love, mm-hmm. Which, by the way, comes up in the near-death experience. When you get the brain out of the way, people talk about it. People talk about this with the psychedelic DMT, mm-hmm. that this one mind is an infinitely loving state of being. That's actually our true nature, and we're sort of trying to get back to that and get rid of all these blocks. So then it becomes a path of how does one do all those things to get the knowledge and the wisdom all the way up, and to be doing selfless service and to be devotional and to have energetic practices. For each person, it might be different. And as having studied spiritual paths, which is more of my second book, is like, what are the commonalities? Whether it's the religious figures that people talk about, like the Buddha or Jesus Christ, or Muhammad, there's parallels in all of these people that have elevated themselves in consciousness, but also in modern day life. There are people that are going through these awakenings all the time. There's a podcast called Buddha at the Gas Pump, which has been very influential for me because the host, Rick Archer, he's interviewed hundreds of people that have had these awakening experiences. Everyday people, it's like you're pumping your gas at the gas station and you see someone there, and that person could be at a very high enlightenment level, but they're just normal people. That people go on these four pathways. But for me, it started with knowledge. It was all wanting to learn, what does the science say? But as I've progressed in my own journey, I've been thinking about these other pathways. How am I serving? How am I being devotional? What kinds of energy practices am I doing? And the interesting thing about these pathways is that they're interrelated. That when one learns more about the nature of reality, the conclusions that one will reach is the conclusions are that we are part of this one mind. There's an unconditional love aspect. We're interconnected, and that would naturally make us want to be of service more because we're interconnected. It would also make us naturally more devotional and more gracious because we're part of this broader intelligence. It would naturally make us want to improve our energetic body, to be more connected on a physical level to this. So it's like you start on one path, but the others naturally become incorporated with it. So what is going back to your original question, I think what you're alluding to is like kind of how do we at an individual and collective level get to this point where we're more connected to truth? Because I think truth is something along the lines of what we're discussing. And I think the way we do it is by reorienting our lives. And I start my second book by asking a question. I say, what is the overall intention of your life? And I ask people to think about that. And the whole book is devoted to answering that question. And I answer for myself. But if we really think hard about what's the intention of our life, where is our compass pointed? And then actually live a life that seems to be in alignment with reality, to me, that is the ultimate solution. Because when we shift our consciousness, reality shifts. And if we shift consciousness collectively, how does reality shift? That's a big deal. And I want to give one really concrete example that I like to talk about in every interview if I can, because this is a life-changing topic. It's actually episode 6 of my podcast. We did a whole episode on it. It's called The Life Review.
Yes.
And the life review is experienced in the near-death experience. In short, it's an NDE. And the NDE, which I mentioned, is a time when the brain is barely functional or non-functional, and yet a person has a lucid experience. So Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, who I interviewed for my podcast, he's been studying these near-death experiences for decades, and he says we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever. What is going on? You get the brain out of the way and people are hovering over their bodies. They talk about this unconditional love sense. They see deceased relatives sometimes. Sometimes they see beings of light. And sometimes they'll see things in the room that upon being resuscitated are validated as accurate. So they'll be like, I hovered over my body. I saw my own resuscitation. I saw something in the other room. I saw something on the roof or the ledge or something outside. And they come back in, and then the doctors or their family say, wait, no, that's not possible. What you're describing is accurate. And these are very significant. They're known as veridical out-of-body experiences, meaning the thing they experienced was verified as accurate. You know what that means? It's not a hallucination by definition. So I give that preface to say that, okay, what happens in the NDE state, the near-death experience, is very significant to tell us something about the nature of reality. What are we missing with our brain? What is the blindfold blocking out? And what people often report is a life review, also in the state of being out of their body or whatever, where they relive their whole life in a very short amount of time. So something with time is weird, that you could relive your whole life in a short amount of time. But what people say is that not only do they relive the events through their own eyes and feel everything that they experience, but they relive it through the eyes of the people that they impacted, as if they were that person. Okay, so this is the idea of interconnectivity, the one mind. It's like when we're in this other dimension of reality, the one mind can switch lenses. It can be multiple whirlpools at once. This is incredibly significant because when people come back in their bodies afterwards, after the life review, they say, whoa, these materialistic things I cared about, those are not the things I was seeing in my life review. I didn't see how much money was in my bank account in my life review. I saw how I treated the cashier at the grocery store and how that action, positively or negatively, impacted every other person in line afterwards. So what people say frequently is the little things are the big things in the life review. And they change their life when they come back often. Sometimes they change their jobs, they get divorced. I interviewed a man named Daniel Brinkley for my podcast who's had 4 life reviews in 4 near-death experiences.
Wow.
He was electrocuted. He was struck by lightning. He had open heart surgery twice, brain surgery once. And each time he had a life review where he relived his combat days in Vietnam. So he experienced the deaths of the people that he killed through their eyes. He got to feel that pain. And for him, it was very difficult to talk about, to have to live through that multiple times. He also told me that he experienced the pain of the child that would no longer have a father because he had killed a father. He felt the indirect effects. He said they were not quite as strong, but he felt the indirect effects. So you can see the rippling of our actions. So just hear that fact for your listeners. And we never know who's going to hear this when. It could be next week. It could be years from now someone hears this. But think about the possibility that a percentage of what I just said is true. Think about it. That this is the nature of reality. We're interconnected. We have an amnesia somehow from it. We don't remember it in this state, but that's the nature of reality, that we're interconnected and our actions actually matter. That could dramatically shift our lives and also shift the lives of others around us because of the way we start to treat them.
Wow, this is just mind-blowing. And that ripple effect, I never thought of it in such a way, but it does make complete sense. Extremely intriguing conversation. I could go on for a very long time. I would still like to start wrapping things up though, and I'm going to ask you some quick fire questions just to start concluding. And the one I always start with is, what does personal development mean to you, since this is the Personal Development Mastery podcast?
Yeah. Well, I would like to commend you on having a personal mastery podcast, because I think it's the most important thing we can do. It is the evolution of our being. And that's, to me, if we combine the reincarnation research that I mentioned at the University of Virginia, it's like the recycling of the water in the whirlpool, in the stream. You become one whirlpool and some of the water gets transferred into another. There's strong evidence for that. And this life review suggests that we're evaluating ourselves. We're seeing how we do in life, no matter what our circumstances are, rich or poor, it doesn't matter. Race, none of that matters in the state. It's how are we treating each other. So what's personal development then? It's the evolution of our consciousness. Some would call that our soul. To me, it's the most important thing we can do, because from one life to the next, even if there is reincarnation and we maybe physically have some, aspects of how we were harmed in a past life shows up in this life, the research suggests that's true. Maybe some of our characteristics from a past life transfer, but I'm not going to take my house with me, my car, my bank account. They don't come with me to the next life. So what's transferred is the evolution of our consciousness. And that seems to be a theme in my research. However the information is obtained through spiritual connections, everyone says the same thing, that we're here to evolve our consciousness. At least that's part of what we're doing. So personal development, that is the evolution of our soul, of our consciousness. What more important thing could we do? That to me is the centerpiece of our whole life, is evolving. And it could manifest differently for different people. Although the elements of the evolution are very similar. It always comes back to self-love. That usually seems to be there is a lack of that in whatever thing we're trying to develop in some way. And that could be if we don't love ourselves enough, we then mistreat other people. It can manifest in different ways, but it usually comes back to this concept of love, not romantic love, so to speak, but it's this something that's transcendent. The idea that we're interconnected and we're expressing that in some way. But it also means that we're whirlpools within the stream. And I think in the spiritual community, there can be a tendency to say that there's only altruism, which is very important, the altruistic aspect. But then there's the individual development aspect. So that can be lost sometimes, to say, well, all I'm going to do is focus on everyone else, which is very admirable and important. But there's the focus on the self too. And it's sort of like when you're on an airplane, they tell you to put your mask on first before your oxygen mask before you can help other people. The personal development, well, will then enable you to help other people more.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Let's say you could go back in time and meet your 18-year-old self. What one piece of advice would you give him?
I was thinking about that this morning. I was thinking about things that have happened in the past. And it's interesting, I have much less regret than I used to, because everything that's happened has led me to this point. And even the things that I maybe cared about before in terms of accomplishments and more material things, that led me to work really hard in school and professionally. And all of those things enabled me to write a book so quickly and to do the things that I do now. So if I were to go back to my 18-year-old self, it's hard because it led me to where I am today, and that enables me to be this vessel. But I would tell myself, I wish I knew what I know now, because there would be much less suffering. There was a lot of suffering that came from having expectations and wanting to have certain achievements and being focused on that without having any context for it.
Can I argue with that suffering might have been your own evolution of your consciousness and you had to go through it?
Yes, you're completely right. It's paradoxical that
Absolutely.
Suffering enables evolution. Absolutely right. And I look at life that way now because I feel that we are in an evolutionary machine, effectively, with intelligence. And this is an important point that I've, in the last few years, have more solidified within myself, that not only is the one mind unconditionally loving, because that seems like that's what people always experience, and it kind of makes sense to me, but it's intelligent and infinitely intelligent. Now, how do I get there? Well, I'm intelligent, you're intelligent, every living species has a degree of intelligence, and we're part of the stream. So that means the stream has intelligence. Logically, it follows. But if we look at the complexity of the universe, down to the smallest levels, looking at atoms, to the biggest galactic levels, there's infinite complexity. So it would stand to reason that this one mind is of infinite intelligence to be able to embody this complexity of the universe.
Yes.
So that means everything in our life, could it be that everything that happens in our life is almost like a mathematical calculation derived for our own evolution? And some would call this karma. It's almost a different way of thinking about it, but it's the same thing, that what happens in our life is a magnetic attraction of what we need in some way to evolve, whether it's coming from this life or from past life, that we're trying to work stuff out for our consciousness is continuing. So we might be working out things that happen in a past life too. So I think there is this element of maybe needing to suffer to balance things out or to learn. And I'm thinking now of Nisargadatta Maharaj, who I think was a great sage, died several decades ago. He said, life is the supreme guru, meaning that everything that happens in our life is our teacher. And if we look at life that way, even though something happens that causes us to suffer, if we can zoom out for a second and be the helicopter looking down, it's like we're almost in a maze and we don't see the high level perspective. We just see what's immediately in front of us. If we can take the time to zoom out and say, maybe there's something ahead in the maze that I don't see. And this suffering that's near term is leading me to something later. That's a good thing. So maybe to re-answer your question, the suffering maybe needed to happen, but I would have had a different way to frame the suffering. To say, okay, I'm suffering right now, but maybe I need this for a certain reason. Yeah.
And it is, as you said, it is a paradox. But it's. I love this question because I get some very interesting answers always. Mark, out of all this conversation we've had today, if you were to give to the listener one actionable item, something they can take away and implement, and what would you tell them?
I go back to the life review. There can be a tendency to not want to think about that conversation that we just had, because the implications are so immense. You can almost want to say, oh, wait, what have I done in my past? Or, whoa, everything I do has ramifications in the world, and there's a rippling effect to my actions, and I have to take personal responsibility. I think that's a big part of our life, is to take personal responsibility. And I think one of the issues in society is a tendency to become a victim and not take responsibility. I will close with this. Ken-Wilber, the philosopher, he says, it's not just about waking up, which is this, having maybe incredible experiences in meditation, feeling the one mind, the unconditional love. That can all be in the bliss. That's part of it. But there's also other areas of development that are somewhat independent. He says there's waking up, there's cleaning up, and there's growing up. And this will be the parting message to your audience. Waking up is very important. So maybe that's doing our knowledge and our meditation and our devotion and our selfless service. But there's cleaning up too, which is looking at our own trauma and figuring out maybe what's been repressed and allowing that to be expressed. Because if we don't clean up, it's going to come back to haunt us in some way, and we're going to be forced to. But there's also growing up, which is this life review concept of responsibility, to accept responsibility for our own actions, and to not just want to shut it out and not to be naive, to acknowledge that there can be darkness as well. So there's waking up and cleaning up and growing up, the maturation process. If we think about our lives in that way, how are we waking up? How are we cleaning up? How are we growing up? And just maybe for a minute a day, ask ourselves that question. And then ask the question, what's the overall intention of my life?
Yes.
And come up with an answer for it. I know I just left a lot of different things. But I will summarize it by saying this. To ask yourself the question, what is the overall intention of my life? How am I orienting my compass? Because if you ask that question, everything else will flow from it.
And I wish more people would ask that question, because I bet that if you ask that question to lots of people, most of them would have never even considered to answer it, sadly. Mark, how can people connect with you and find out more about yourself and what you do?
My website, which is my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. Also, my two books, An End to Upside Down Thinking and An End to Upside Down Living. They're available on Amazon. They're in Kindle, hardcover, and Audible. And my podcast, Where Is My Mind, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, all the major players.
Awesome. Is there, I know for me it was a really intriguing conversation, and we talked about many things, and I'm sure there were like 20 times even more that we could talk about. But from your point of view, is there anything that you were hoping that would be discussed today and we completely missed it?
We covered a lot. Thank you. You asked great questions, very well-informed questions, and I can tell that you've done a lot of thinking about personal development and orienting your compass based on the questions you've asked. So I think we've covered what I would hope to cover, and at the same time, we're in an intelligent universe. And whatever came through in this conversation probably came through for a reason that I don't know, and you asked questions probably that you might not understand fully. And so I'm just going to hope that your audience listens to this whenever they do and that they get what they need from it.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Mark, I want to thank you again for your time and sharing your insights with me today. I want to wish you all the very best with all your plans for the future and helping to bring that knowledge and that scientific proof of what is happening to the world. Any last parting words?
I want to thank your audience for listening this far in the conversation, because if you have, you've been exposed to a lot of ideas. What's fun for me is that I get to spend all this time learning and then pick out what I feel to be the most important pieces, and then we can have these conversations. But I would just encourage your audience that if you're interested in this and you feel a pull, not everyone feels a pull, but some people feel a really strong pull. I would say go with it, because what is the nature of reality? If what we're talking about today is even partially true, then there's probably a desire for all of us innately to want to understand ourself, because ourself is connected to the nature of reality. So I would just give encouragement to go for it, and to maybe, if you're really busy, even to, instead of listening to one podcast a week, listen to 2 podcasts a week. Think about how you can ratchet it up. And I say this from personal experience, that it is really life enhancing and has helped to reduce suffering. There is still suffering, but I can contextualize it much more. And so life improves. Even though it can be a rocky process upward, there can be some down times. It's an overall upward trajectory.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and rate it on Apple Podcasts. And also share this episode with someone who you think will benefit from it. If you want to find out more about what I do and gain access to exclusive content, join my Facebook group Personal Development Mastery. The link is in the show notes, or you can simply type bit.ly/PDM group. And until next time, stand out, don't fit in.